The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt outside St. Benedict's Veterans Hospital in rural Montana, turning the pavement into waves of shimmering heat. Inside, the air conditioning hummed against the silence of long corridors where forgotten men lay waiting for visitors who never came. If you believe some promises transcend a lifetime, leave a like right now and stay until the very end of this story. At the main gate, security guard Roland Chambers noticed her first. A girl no older than 7, wearing a faded denim jacket too large for her frame and clutching a crumpled photograph. Her name was Sutton Bridger, and her sneakers were worn through at the toes. She stood perfectly still, staring down the empty highway as if willing something into existence. "You lost, sweetheart." Roland approached cautiously. Sutton shook her head. "Waiting for someone." "Your folks know you're here." "Grandpa Merrick's inside, room 214. He's dying." Her voice cracked on the last word. "He keeps asking for his brothers, says he made them a promise 50 years ago." Roland's expression softened. He knew Merrick Cade, the silent veteran in the East Wing who never had visitors, who stared out the window every afternoon as if searching for ghosts. "What promise, honey?" Sutton held up the photograph. 7 young men in leather jackets stood beside motorcycles, their faces bronzed by desert sun. The words "Iron Ridge Chapter" painted on a garage door behind them. One face was circled in red ink, young Merrick, barely 20, grinning like the world couldn't touch him. He said they swore to ride together forever, that if one fell, the others would come, but nobody came when he got sick. Tears pooled in her eyes. "I tried calling everyone. Nobody knows where they are." Roland crouched to her level. "So what are you doing out here?" "I saw motorcycles passing on the highway yesterday. Lots of them. Grandpa said his brothers wore patches like wolves. I thought maybe." She trailed off, embarrassed. "I thought maybe if I waited long enough, someone would hear me." It sounded like a child's desperate fantasy. But something in her conviction made Roland uncomfortable, not because it was foolish, but because he recognized it. He'd seen that same stubborn hope in the eyes of men who'd survived impossible odds, who refused to believe the world had abandoned them. "Tell you what," Roland said gently, "you go back inside and sit with your grandpa. I'll make some calls." Sutton's face brightened, then fell. "You promise?" The word hung between them. Roland thought of his own father, buried with full honors but no family present. He thought of the way dying men gripped your hand when they had something unsaid. "I promise." Roland Chambers had been a Marine before he became a security guard, and Marines understood the language of brotherhood better than most. He made 3 calls before he found someone who recognized the Iron Ridge Chapter, a motorcycle club that had disbanded in 1978 after a highway accident killed 2 members and scattered the rest. The contact was a woman named Jessamine Cord, who ran a veteran outreach center in Billings. She listened to his story with the kind of attention that comes from hearing too many like it. "Merrick Cade," she repeated slowly. "I know that name. He rode with Thorne Blackridge's crew." "Can you reach him?" "Thorne's been gone 20 years, but his son might know where the others ended up. Give me an hour." Roland spent that hour watching Sutton through the window of room 214. She sat beside her grandfather's bed, holding his weathered hand, reading aloud from a book about wolves. Merrick's eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, as if her voice alone kept him tethered. Jessamine called back with the single number. "This connects to a man named Garrett Voss. He rode with them back in the 70s. Runs a motorcycle repair shop in Wyoming now. If anyone can activate that old network, it's him. Roland dialed. The line rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. Voss Garage. Mr. Voss, my name is Roland Chambers. I'm calling about Merrick Cade. Silence stretched across the line, long enough that Roland thought the connection had dropped. Then, Merrick's alive. Barely. He's at St. Benedict's Hospital in Montana. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Doctors say he has days, maybe a week. Jesus. The word came out like a prayer. What does he need? His granddaughter says he keeps asking for his brothers. She's 7 years old, Mr. Voss. She's sitting outside the hospital gate waiting for motorcycles because he told her stories about riding with people who swore never to leave each other behind. Another pause. Roland heard something metallic clatter in the background, a wrench hitting concrete. You got an address? Roland gave it. How many beds in that hospital? What? How many beds, son? Maybe 80. Why? Because you're about to see every one of those old bastards show up. Garrett's voice carried 50 years of grief and sudden purpose. Tell Merrick to hold on. Tell him the Iron Ridge chapter keeps its promises. The line went dead. Garrett Voss stood in his garage, staring at the phone in his hand as if it had delivered news from the afterlife. Around him, half-assembled motorcycles gleamed under fluorescent lights, their chrome surfaces reflecting a man whose hands had built more machines than he could count, but had never forgotten the one promise that mattered most. He pulled a leather-bound notebook from a drawer. Pages yellowed with age, phone numbers scratched in margins, addresses crossed out and rewritten. Names he hadn't spoken aloud in decades: Camden Reese, Kellen Frost, Dax Morrow, Leith Stone. The first call went to Camden, who ran a construction company in Colorado. The conversation was brief. Merrick's dying. Where? Montana, St. Benedict's. I'll be there by morning. No questions, no hesitation. Just the immediate acknowledgement of a debt that time could never erase. Kellen answered from a fishing boat off the Oregon coast. Dax picked up in the middle of a poker game in Nevada. Leith was teaching welding at a community college in Idaho. Each conversation carried the same weight. The sudden recognition that the years had stolen something they'd promised never to give up. But Garrett didn't stop at the original members. He called their sons, their nephews, men who'd joined the club in later years and carried the Iron Ridge name long after the chapter closed. He called mechanics and veterans, firefighters and truck drivers, anyone who'd ever worn that wolf patch or rode beside someone who had. By midnight, his phone had logged 47 outgoing calls. By 2 in the morning, the first engines roared to life across 6 states. Back at St. Benedict's, Sutton had fallen asleep in the chair beside her grandfather's bed, her small hand still wrapped around his. Merrick's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but searching, as if he could hear something approaching from a great distance. The low thunder of engines, the promise kept, the brothers coming home. Nurse Delancey Vale checked his vitals and noted the slight uptick in his heart rate. She'd worked in hospice long enough to recognize when someone was holding on for something specific. She just didn't know what. Outside, Roland Chambers stood at the gate, scanning the empty highway. He'd been a fool to make that promise to a child. He'd been a fool to believe that old men who'd scattered across half a country would drop everything for someone they hadn't seen in 40 years. But something in Garrett Voss's voice had convinced him otherwise. And now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. Dawn broke cold over Montana, painting the mountains in shades of copper and ash. Roland had gone home at midnight, returned at 5 with coffee he couldn't taste, and now stood shivering at his post while the highway remained empty. He was about to head inside when he heard it, a sound like distant thunder rolling across the valley. Then he saw them. 3 motorcycles crested the eastern ridge, moving in tight formation. As they drew closer, Roland could make out the riders. Older men, with grey beards and weathered faces, their leather jackets worn soft with age. No club patches, no flashy chrome, just the quiet dignity of people who'd ridden through decades of storms. They pulled into the hospital parking lot and killed their engines simultaneously. The lead rider removed his helmet, revealing a face that could have been carved from stone. Roland Chambers. "That's me. Camden Reese, we spoke yesterday." His voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime giving orders that were followed without question. "Where's Merrick?" "Room 214, but visiting hours. Don't start with ours." Camden's tone wasn't aggressive, just final. "We rode through the night. We're going in." Roland should have stopped them. Hospital policy was clear. But something about the way these men moved, purposeful, unified, unburdened by doubt, made him step aside. They walked through the corridors like soldiers returning to a battlefield, their boots echoing against polished floors. Nurses turned to stare. Patients peered from doorways, but Camden and his companions paid no attention, focused entirely on the room number that had pulled them across state lines, room 214. The door stood half open. Inside, Sutton sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing pictures on construction paper while her grandfather slept. She looked up as the 3 men entered, her eyes widening, not with fear, but with sudden, incandescent hope. "Are you his brothers?" Camden approached the bed slowly, as if moving through water. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch Merrick's shoulder. "Yeah, kid, we're his brothers." Merrick's eyes opened, cloudy, confused, fighting through layers of medication. Then clarity struck like lightning. "Cam, I'm here, brother." "You came." Merrick's voice broke. I thought you'd forgotten." "We don't forget." Camden gripped his hand. "Iron Ridge never forgets." The other 2 riders moved closer. Kellen Frost knelt beside the bed, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. Dax Morrow stood at the foot, arms crossed, jaw clenched against emotion he'd spent 50 years learning to suppress. "The others?" Merrick whispered. "On their way," Camden said. "Every last one who can ride is coming." Sutton stood up, clutching her drawings. "You really came because of a promise?" Kellen turned to her, his expression soft. "Your grandpa saved my life in 1972, pulled me from a burning bike after I hit black ice outside Bozeman. Never asked for anything in return, just said, 'We ride together.' That kind of debt doesn't expire." By noon, the parking lot of St. Benedict's Veterans Hospital had transformed into something the town had never seen. Motorcycles lined every available space. Vintage Harley-Davidsons, rebuilt Triumphs, custom choppers that had crossed entire mountain ranges overnight. Men ranging from their 60s to their 80s dismounted stiffly, stretching road-weary muscles, greeting each other with the abbreviated gestures of people who'd shared something words couldn't capture. Nurse Delancey Vale stood at the window, counting. 23, 37, 49. "Who are these people?" her supervisor asked. "I don't know," but they all asked for room 214. The hospital administrator, a nervous man named Fletcher Moss, appeared in the hallway with security protocols in hand. "We can't allow this. Fire codes." "With respect, sir," Roland interrupted, "I don't think you understand what's happening here. I understand that we have 80 patients and limited space. These men rode through the night because one of their brothers is dying. They're not going anywhere." Fletcher's mouth opened, closed. He looked at the motorcycles, at the weathered faces of men who'd clearly survived worse than bureaucratic resistance, and made the only sensible decision. Keep them orderly, no more than 5 in the room at a time. In room 214, Merrick had been propped into a sitting position, color returning to his cheeks, despite the cancer devouring him from within. Sutton had claimed a chair in the corner, watching with wide eyes, as her grandfather's entire history materialized in leather and denim. Garrett Voss entered next, moving with the careful precision of someone whose knees had logged too many miles. He carried a package wrapped in oil-stained cloth. "Merrick Cade, still ugly as hell." Merrick laughed, a sound that seemed impossible given his condition. "Voss, you son of a bitch, had brought you something." Garrett unwrapped the package, revealing a motorcycle jacket, faded black leather, wolf patch on the back, M. Cade embroidered above the pocket. "Been keeping this in storage. Figured you might want it." Merrick's hand trembled as he touched the leather. "I thought it burned in the garage fire." "Thorne pulled it out before the flames spread. Made me promise to return it when the time came. Thorne's gone. His promise isn't." One by one they came. Leith Stone, who'd lost an arm in a factory accident but still rode with custom controls. Ronan Webb, blind in one eye, navigating by memory and instinct. Jasper Colt, walking with a cane but refusing help up the stairs. Each carried pieces of shared history, photographs, letters, small objects that meant nothing to outsiders, but everything to the men who'd sworn oaths beneath western stars 50 years prior. Delancey watched from the doorway, no longer pretending to check vitals. She'd worked in end-of-life care for 15 years, witnessed countless deaths both peaceful and agonized, but she'd never seen anything like this. The way a dying man transformed when surrounded by living proof that his life had mattered, that his promises had been kept, that he would not die alone and forgotten. By evening, 62 motorcycles filled the parking lot, and more were coming. As sunset painted the hospital windows gold, the administrators stopped trying to enforce visiting hours. They'd witnessed something that defied policy, a gathering that felt less like a disruption and more like a ceremony. Nurses brought extra chairs. Maintenance cleared the adjacent conference room. Someone donated folding tables where riders could rest between shifts at Merrick's bedside. Sutton had become the unofficial chronicler of the event, moving through the crowd with her drawings and questions, learning names she'd never heard her grandfather speak. These men answered with patience that surprised even themselves, explaining forgotten roads and long-gone diners, the way headlights looked cutting through desert darkness, the feeling of absolute freedom that came from riding away from everything you'd known. "Why motorcycles?" she asked Garrett Voss. He considered the question seriously. "Because when you're riding, you can't hide. The wind strips away every lie you've told yourself. You're just a human being moving through space, holding on, trusting that the machine will carry you and your brothers will catch you if you fall." "Did you ever fall?" "Many times, and they always caught me." In room 214, Merrick had begun telling stories. Fragments at first, then longer narratives as memory and morphine reached an uneasy truce. He spoke of the summer of 1971, when they'd ridden from Montana to Mexico on bikes held together with wire and prayer. He described Camden saving him from a bar fight in Wyoming, Kellen teaching him to rebuild engines in a garage that no longer existed, the night Dax pulled him from a frozen creek after his bike went through thin ice. "We were stupid," Merrick said, his voice thin but clear. "Thought we were invincible, but we learned something most people never figure out." "What's that?" Camden asked. "That brotherhood isn't about blood. It's about choosing someone and saying, 'I'll remember you when everyone else forgets. I'll come when you call. I'll keep promises even when it costs me everything.'" Delancey Vale stood in the corner, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't alone. 3 other nurses had gathered outside the door, listening. "How many times do you think he believed nobody would come?" one whispered. "Every day since they scattered," Delancey replied. "Every single day." Sutton climbed onto the bed beside her grandfather, fitting herself carefully against his side. "Are you happy now?" Merrick stroked her hair. "I'm complete. There's a difference." Outside, the sun dropped below the mountains. Motion sensor lights clicked on across the parking lot, illuminating rows of motorcycles that gleamed like monuments. More engines approached from the south. Another convoy finding its way through darkness, pulled by a promise made when the world was young and death seemed impossibly distant. If this story is touching your heart, leave a like right now and share it with someone who needs to remember what real loyalty looks like. 74 riders now, and the night was far from over. By midnight, the hospital had transformed into something between a vigil and a reunion. The cafeteria stayed open late, serving coffee to men who'd forgotten how to sleep when memory called. Conversations spilled into corridors, quiet exchanges about children grown, marriages ended, jobs lost and found, the weight of decades compressed into hours of shared recognition. In the parking lot, younger riders arrived, sons and nephews of original members, men who'd heard the stories but never believed they were literal truth. They stood among the vintage motorcycles, understanding for the first time that their fathers' tales of unbreakable bonds weren't exaggeration or nostalgia, but documented fact. One young man, maybe 25, approached Roland at the gate. "My dad's inside, Camden Reese." "I know him. He left Colorado at 3 in the morning, didn't even pack a bag, just said, 'Merrick needs me,' and walked out. I thought he'd lost his mind." The young man's voice cracked. "I didn't understand until I got here." "Understand what?" "That some promises transcend everything else. Family, career, common sense. My dad rode 9 hours through a storm because 50 years ago someone taught him that 'I'll be there' isn't a courtesy. It's a contract." Inside, Merrick had drifted into shallow sleep, but his hand remained locked around Camden's wrist, as if afraid to let go. Sutton had curled up in an armchair, covered with a jacket that smelled like gasoline and old leather, Dax's contribution to her comfort. Garrett Voss sat in the corner, the leather-bound notebook open on his lap. He'd begun reading aloud from entries made in different hands, different years. A record of rides taken, promises kept, moments when the club had rallied for one member facing impossible odds. August 1973, Leith Stone's house burned down. We rebuilt it in 6 days. November 1975. Kellen Frost's daughter needed surgery he couldn't afford. We held a benefit ride, raised $12,000. March 1977. Ronan Webb's wife left him. We rode to his place every night for 3 months, until he remembered how to smile. Each entry was signed by the man who'd called for help and witnessed by the brothers who'd answered. Dozens of small emergencies, hundreds of accumulated debts, the patient architecture of mutual obligation that had somehow survived divorce, distance, death. "Why didn't you keep riding together?" Sutton asked, suddenly awake. The room fell silent. These men had traveled halfway across the country to sit vigil, but nobody had yet voiced the question that haunted all of them. Finally, Camden spoke. "Because we got scared." Of what? Of losing each other the way we lost Thorne and Marcus. After the accident in '78, it felt like every ride was tempting fate. We convinced ourselves that staying away was safer than watching more brothers die. He looked at Merrick's sleeping face. But we were wrong. Distance doesn't prevent loss. It just makes you lose people while they're still alive. Kellen Frost stood abruptly, moving to the window. His reflection stared back, a man who'd spent 40 years convincing himself that dissolution was mercy rather than cowardice. "Merrick sent letters," he said quietly. "For years after we scattered. Birthday cards, Christmas notes, invitations to his granddaughter's birth. I never responded, told myself it was better to let the past stay past." We all did that," Dax added. "All of us except Garrett." Garrett closed the notebook. Someone had to remember. Someone had to keep the list. Dawn arrived with the sound of more engines, the final wave of riders who'd traveled farthest, crossing from California and Texas and New Mexico. They rolled into the parking lot silently, engines cutting one by one, until 87 motorcycles stood in perfect rows like soldiers at attention. The morning light caught chrome and leather, transforming the parking lot into something that resembled a military formation more than a hospital gathering. Each rider dismounted with the careful movements of men who'd pushed their bodies beyond reasonable limits, who'd ridden through rain and darkness because a voice from the past had finally called them home. Merrick woke to find his room crowded with ghosts made flesh. Men he hadn't seen since the Carter administration stood shoulder to shoulder, filling every available space, their presence a physical weight that pressed against sterile walls designed for isolation and measured death. The morphine fog cleared just enough for him to understand what he was seeing, not memory, not hallucination, but living proof that some oaths survive everything. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice breaking on the single word. "All of you." "All of us," Garrett confirmed, stepping forward to grip his shoulder. "Every last brother who could still throw a leg over a bike. Some who probably shouldn't have tried." Ronan Webb laughed from the doorway, his blind eye catching the fluorescent light. "Took me 14 hours. Got lost twice. Worth every mile." Merrick's hand trembled as he reached toward them, as if physical contact might prove they weren't phantoms conjured by dying neurons. Camden caught his wrist, held it firm. "We're real, brother. We're here. We're not leaving." Sutton had been awake for hours, taking photographs with the disposable camera Delancey had given her. She moved among the riders like a documentarian, capturing faces that told 50 years of stories in lines and scars and weathered patience. Each man lowered himself to her height when she approached, answering questions with the solemnity usually reserved for battlefield debriefings. "Did you ever get scared on the road?" she asked Jasper Colt. "Every time," he admitted. "Fear's just part of riding. You learn to carry it without letting it stop you. Like coming here even though Grandpa's dying." Jasper's expression softened. especially like that. Fletcher Moss, the hospital administrator, appeared in the doorway around 8 o'clock, holding a clipboard that trembled slightly in his hands. His carefully rehearsed speech about regulations and capacity limits died on his lips as he surveyed the room. Not chaos, but something approaching reverence. These men weren't disrupting care. They were providing it in ways no medical protocol could replicate. Mr. Cade, we need to discuss. Let me stop you right there. Camden stood, positioning himself between bureaucracy and brotherhood, his considerable frame blocking the doorway. Whatever rule we're breaking, we'll break it. Whatever fire code we're violating, we'll violate it. These men rode through the night because one of their brothers is dying. Some of them are in their 70s. Some haven't been on a motorcycle in a decade. They came anyway. If you need someone arrested for that, arrest me. But we're not leaving until Merrick tells us to go. Fletcher opened his mouth, closed it, then did something unexpected. His shoulders relaxed and genuine warmth flooded his features. I was going to say we've cleared the West Wing chapel if you want more space, and the cafeteria will provide lunch for everyone at no charge. My father was a Marine, died in a VA hospital in Arizona with nobody there but a night nurse who didn't know his name. I understand brotherhood, gentlemen. Stay as long as you need. The tension broke, like glass shattering in reverse, fragments of suspicion and defensiveness reforming into something whole. Several riders exhaled audibly. Kellen Frost actually laughed, a sound rusty with disuse, like machinery awakening after decades of silence. "Thank you," Camden said, extending his hand. Fletcher shook it with both of his own. "No, thank you, for showing my staff what loyalty actually looks like." By 10 o'clock, word had spread through the hospital. Patients in wheelchairs rolled themselves to the corridors to catch glimpses of the gathering. Families paused mid-visit, sensing they were witnessing something rare. A young doctor named Pritchard, fresh from residency and still believing medicine was purely scientific, found himself standing in the doorway of room 214 with tears on his face. "I don't understand," he whispered to Delancey Vale. "You're watching a man receive the only medicine that actually matters," she replied, "proof that his life created something larger than himself." By noon, the chapel had filled with leather-clad men sitting in pews designed for grieving families, their weathered hands folded in something between prayer and meditation. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting their faces in shades of amber and blue. The silence held weight, not uncomfortable but expectant, like the moment before thunder breaks. A hospital chaplain named Reverend Thackett, caught off guard by the gathering, stood at the altar uncertain how to proceed. He'd prepared standard condolences, rehearsed verses about mortality and grace. But looking at these men, their scarred knuckles and road-worn faces, the way they sat with backs straight despite obvious pain, he understood that conventional religion had nothing to offer this congregation. "This isn't a funeral," Garrett Voss said from the front pew, his voice carrying to the back row. "No," Reverend Thackett agreed, abandoning his notes. "It's a renewal of vows." The phrase settled over them like benediction. One by one, the riders stood and spoke, not eulogies, but affirmations. Promises made again, this time with the full weight of 5 decades teaching them what words truly meant, what they cost, why they mattered more than comfort or convenience. Camden went first, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. Merrick Cade taught me that showing up is the hardest and most important thing you can do. When my marriage fell apart in '83, he rode 300 miles just to sit on my porch and drink beer in silence. Didn't offer advice, didn't judge, just showed up. I failed that lesson for 40 years after we scattered, convinced myself that distance was mercy, that staying away prevented pain. But pain found me anyway, the pain of living half a life, surrounded by people who knew my name, but not my history. I'm here now, and I won't fail again. Iron Ridge rides until the last of us falls. Kellen followed, unfolding himself from the pew with obvious difficulty, knees protesting decades of motorcycle vibration. I was afraid of loss, so I chose loss on my own terms. Told myself that cutting ties was cleaner than watching brothers die. But you know what? I lost them anyway. Lost 40 years of shared meals, of phone calls on birthdays, of knowing someone had my back. That was cowardice dressed up as wisdom. Merrick deserved better. We all deserved better. I'm 68 years old, and I just figured out that being afraid of goodbye doesn't make hello any less necessary. Dax Morrow spoke with difficulty, his normally gravelly voice breaking into fragments. I've lived alone in a cabin outside Reno for 30 years. Told people I like solitude. Truth is, I was terrified of caring again. Watching Marcus die in that accident in '78, it broke something in me. I thought if I never loved anyone that deeply again, I'd never hurt that badly again. But watching Merrick die, surrounded by brothers who loved him enough to come, I finally understand what I've been missing. Safety isn't the absence of pain. It's having people who'll sit with you while you hurt. Leith Stone stood last, one-armed and unbowed, his prosthetic sleeve pinned neatly against his chest. I lost this arm in 1989. Factory accident. Thought my riding days were over. Thought my useful days were over. Garrett called me every week for 3 years until I agreed to try again. Custom controls, adaptive equipment. He researched everything, paid for half of it himself. Never asked for thanks. Just said, Iron Ridge doesn't leave brothers behind. Well, I'm here to say it back. Iron Ridge rides again, today, tomorrow, until the last of us falls. And even then, our sons will remember, our granddaughters will remember. He looked directly at Sutton, who sat in the front row clutching her camera, because some stories are too important to let die. The riders began standing spontaneously, pledging renewed commitment not just to Merrick, but to each other, to the families they'd neglected, to the young men watching who needed to understand that brotherhood wasn't mythology. It was maintenance, daily and deliberate and difficult. We'll establish monthly rides, Garrett announced. No exceptions, no excuses. And we'll expand. Every forgotten veteran in every hospital within 500 miles, we'll find them, visit them, make sure nobody dies wondering if they mattered. The vote was unanimous, sealed not with paperwork, but with clasped hands and nodded heads, the ancient language of men who'd learned that some contracts transcend signatures. Outside, the sun climbed higher, its light transforming the chapel windows into panels of liquid gold that spilled across worn leather and silver hair, baptizing a promise reborn. 3 days after the first riders arrived, Merrick Cade passed away at 4:47 in the morning, with Sutton asleep on his chest and 37 brothers standing witness in shifts throughout the night. His breathing had grown shallow around midnight, each inhalation requiring visible effort, but he'd fought to remain conscious, his eyes tracking from face to face, as if memorizing features he'd carry into whatever came next. Camden held his right hand. Garrett held his left. Between them, Generations of shared roads stretched invisible but tangible, the miles logged, the promises kept, the way trust accumulates like interest when men choose to be faithful to something larger than self-preservation. His last words were directed at his granddaughter, spoken in a whisper Garrett had to strain to hear over the monitor's steady beeping. "Tell them I kept the promise too." Then silence. Not the dramatic flatline of television dramas, but a simple cessation, the body finally surrendering what it had held beyond reasonable limits. Sutton woke to stillness. She looked at her grandfather's face, peaceful now in ways it hadn't been for months, then at the circle of men surrounding the bed. None of them spoke. They simply stood, bearing witness, their presence transforming a hospital room into sacred ground. Delancey Vale entered to pronounce the official time of death, but she paused in the doorway, recognizing something she'd rarely seen in 15 years of hospice work. A good death, surrounded by love that had traveled across states and decades to prove itself real. "He knew," she said softly. "At the end, he knew he wasn't alone." "None of us are," Camden replied. "Not anymore." The funeral was held on a Thursday afternoon at Mountain View Cemetery, overlooking the valley where Merrick had been born 73 years prior. The sky broke clear after days of rain, as if nature itself had paused to acknowledge what was happening. 87 motorcycles formed a procession that stretched for 2 miles, their engines throttling in synchronized rhythm, a sound that rattled windows and stopped traffic and made people emerge from houses to watch history pass. Children pointed, old men saluted. A woman standing outside a grocery store placed her hand over her heart as the convoy rolled by, understanding without words that she was witnessing something rare, a generation's final stand against isolation and forgetting. The riders wore their cleanest leather, their club patches prominent now, the wolf insignia of Iron Ridge restored to shoulders that had carried it across half a century. Garrett had spent 3 days tracking down original patches in storage units and attics, reconstructing the visual language of belonging that had been packed away in 1978. At the graveside, they formed ranks 6 deep, creating a wall of leather and loyalty around the immediate family. Sutton stood at the front, wearing her grandfather's jacket, too large for her frame, the sleeves rolled multiple times, but she refused to remove it. In her hand, she clutched the disposable camera, now loaded with its final frame. The service was brief. Reverend Thackett spoke about promises and brotherhood, about how some men measure their lives not in years, but in the bonds they forge and maintain. He quoted no scripture. These men had their own gospel written in scars and shared survival. When the coffin lowered, the riders simultaneously revved their engines, 90 seconds of sustained thunder that echoed across the valley and sent birds scattering from trees. It was farewell and declaration both. "We were here. We will not forget. Your life mattered." Sutton took the final photograph. 87 men standing at attention as their brother descended into earth that would hold him, but not diminish what he'd built. But the story didn't end at the graveside. That evening, in the hospital chapel where they'd renewed their vows 3 days earlier, the Iron Ridge chapter, reformed after 47 years of dissolution, convened for the founding meeting of the Merrick Cade Memorial Foundation. Its mission, written on a legal pad in Garrett's careful handwriting, find forgotten veterans in hospice care and ensure nobody dies alone. "We'll need structure," Camden said. assuming leadership with the ease of someone who'd spent a career managing construction crews. Monthly rides to designated facilities, rotating volunteers, a database of forgotten veterans. And funding, Kellen added. Gas money, food, emergency support for families who can't afford burial costs. I'll handle fundraising, Dax volunteered. We can organize benefit rides, sell merchandise. People will support this once they understand what we're doing. We're correcting a collective failure, Leith said quietly. Society abandons its veterans in old age. We're standing against that. It's revolutionary work disguised as simple decency. They worked through the night, drafting bylaws and organizing committees, transforming grief into architecture. By dawn, they had a functional framework. By the end of the week, they'd visited their first facility, a VA hospital in Idaho, where 11 veterans had gone 6 months without non-medical visitors. Within 6 months, the foundation had expanded to 43 facilities across 11 states. Riders showed up on scheduled dates, brought photographs and stories, sat beside beds holding hands of men who'd thought the world had finished with them. Some visits lasted minutes. Others stretched into hours of shared history and mutual recognition. The transformation was documented in letters that arrived at Garrett's garage, handwritten notes from nurses and social workers describing how patients who'd been withdrawn and unresponsive suddenly became animated, remembering details of service they hadn't spoken about in decades. How dying men asked for haircuts and fresh clothes because they knew brothers were coming. How families reached out asking if the foundation could visit their fathers, their uncles, the grandfathers who'd served and been forgotten. Sutton Bridger, at 7 years old, became the organization's youngest volunteer. She visited hospitals with her mother on weekends, carrying the same disposable camera, now digital, loaded with unlimited frames, documenting faces that deserved to be remembered. She'd developed a gift for asking questions that unlocked stories. What was your proudest moment? Who did you think about when you were scared? What promise did you make that you kept? The photographs filled a growing archive, maintained by Delancey Vale, who'd taken leave from St. Benedict's to work full-time as the Foundation's Director of Documentation. Each image carried a caption: name, service branch, years active, something specific they'd contributed to the world. No generic eulogies, just facts proving these lives had mattered in concrete, measurable ways. On the first anniversary of Merrick's death, the Iron Ridge chapter returned to St. Benedict's. They brought flowers, wildflowers from the valley where he'd been buried, not expensive arrangements from florists who'd never known him. They brought photographs spanning 50 years, young men beside gleaming motorcycles, middle-aged faces weathered by time, recent images of the Reformed chapter riding together, and they brought 87 candles, one for each rider who'd answered the call a year earlier. They gathered in the parking lot where it had all begun, standing in the exact spots their motorcycles had occupied when the first convoy arrived. The sun set over Montana with the same copper intensity it had that morning when Camden Reese crested the eastern ridge and saw Roland Chambers waiting at the gate. Delancey Vale, the nurse who'd witnessed it all, spoke at the brief ceremony. Her voice carried across the assembled crowd, riders, hospital staff, families of veterans the Foundation had served, reporters documenting something that defied easy categorization. I've worked in hospice for 16 years. I've seen people die surrounded by expensive equipment and medical expertise, technology that can measure every biological function except the only one that matters, whether a life had meaning. And I've seen a man dying in a standard hospital room become the richest person I've ever met, because 87 motorcycles proved that promises aren't empty words. They're living things that survive death, that grow stronger when tested, that transform individual lives into collective legacy. She paused, tears streaming freely now, making no attempt to hide emotion she'd spent years learning to suppress for professional reasons. Merrick Kay died knowing he mattered, that his life created ripples reaching across decades, that he was loved not despite his flaws, but because he showed up when it counted, for his brothers, for his granddaughter, for the idea that we owe each other more than polite distance. Every patient in every hospital deserves that. And because of all of you, because you chose to remember rather than forget, more people are receiving it. Last month alone, we visited 63 veterans. 63 people who were dying alone now know they matter. That's resurrection work. That's what Merrick made possible. The candles were lit one by one, flames flickering in the evening breeze. Sutton stood at the center, holding her grandfather's jacket, the one Garrett had retrieved from storage, the one that still smelled like old leather and gasoline and promises kept. She'd grown taller in the past year, but the jacket still swallowed her. She wore it anyway, understanding that some inheritance has nothing to do with fit. "What happens now?" she asked Camden Reese. He knelt to her level, his own eyes reflecting candlelight. "Now we keep riding, for Merrick, for each other, for everyone who needs to remember that brotherhood still exists. And when you're old enough, you'll ride with us, because you're Iron Ridge now. Blood doesn't make family, promises do." Latu. The engines started simultaneously, a thunderous declaration that shook the ground and rose into the darkening sky. They rode out of the parking lot in formation, headlights cutting through twilight, carrying with them a truth the world desperately needed to remember, that showing up is sacred work, that promises matter, that we are only as strong as our willingness to be there when someone calls. Sutton watched until the last taillight disappeared over the ridge. Then she walked back into the hospital, where 3 more forgotten veterans waited in rooms without visitors, where her grandfather's legacy had just begun its second chapter. Some bonds transcend blood, some promises survive death, and sometimes, when a small voice asks the impossible, 87 motorcycles prove that miracles are just promises kept by ordinary people choosing extraordinary loyalty. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember what real brotherhood looks like. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories of northern loyalty travel. Until the next story, ride safe and keep your promises.